3:30, well, almost 3:30, so if we could all take seats. If somebody would tell the people out in the hallway and in the exhibition area that we're going to get ready to start, so in case they want to come in here, I'd appreciate it. Hey, Cynthia, would you have somebody tell the people in the exhibition area we're going to start the last panel? Thank you. Certainly, you can come up and get yourself situated here. And I'll say Antonio a little bit. We're getting people in here. They went to the exhibition hall to tell everybody.
Someone left me. Oh, that's just
Yeah.
that's where that was someone's real password.
I'll introduce you in a second. Antonio. We're trying to get everybody in here from the exhibition hall because this is a really important topic that we've got right now, and I'd like everybody to hear it. And it's the last panel before we have drinks, which is very important, but we want you to hear this panel, so. Okay, we'll get started. I'll introduce the moderator while we're waiting for people to come in. They're slowly coming in the door. Okay, so our moderator today for the panel D, let's talk regulatory, which is very important, is Antonio Ortega, Governmental Affairs Specialist from the Imperial Irrigation District. Antonio Ortega is the Governmental Affairs Specialist at the IID. He is responsible for coordinating the district's governmental affairs programs and activities to deliver maximum value from IID's water and energy resource portfolio. To this end, he promotes IID policies, programs, and initiatives through liaison, communication, coordination, and interaction with federal, state, and regional governmental and legislative agencies. Prior to joining the district, he served as senior field representative for Assemblyman V. Manuel Perez, and has also worked in the state capitol as a legislative aide for Assemblyman Hector De La Torre and Senator Abel Maldonado. Mr. Ortega is a graduate of the University of California at Riverside, having earned a bachelor's degree in sociology in 2006. Please welcome Antonio Ortega.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Mark, for my introduction. So, first and foremost, I want to say that I feel honored and privileged to introduce these distinguished speakers. I believe that in the 6-year history of the Renewable Energy Summit, this is the first time that we have not only 2 sitting commissioners, one from the Public Utilities Commission, one from the Energy Commission, but also a former commissioner from the Energy Commission with Mrs. Edson. So we want to welcome you and thank you for making the trek down to Imperial County and joining us here for our 6th annual Renewable Energy Summit. Just to inform the structure of the panel, I will introduce each of the speakers before they come up here and give their presentations. I will ask that you all engage with the panel, and if you have any questions, please fill out one of those cards. Raise your hand so one of the IVDC staff can bring them up here. I want to make sure that we allow some time at the end for Q&A with our speakers and some intra-panel discussion for some questions that we have prepared ahead of time. So without further ado, let me first introduce Karen Etzen. Ms. Etzen is a 30-year veteran of public affairs and policy and Vice President of Policy and Client Services of the California Independent System Operator, also known as a CAL-ISO. She joined the organization in 2005 and has a responsibility for areas of customer service and industry affairs, government regulatory affairs, communications, and policy development. Prior to joining the ISO, Ms. Etzen served in a number of senior roles with state government, including commissioner at the CEC, as I just mentioned, and assistant director of the California Research Bureau. From 1985 through 2000, she headed a small consulting firm that specialized in energy policy development and power plant permitting, with clients that included major geothermal power plant developers. So if you could please join me in welcoming Ms. Karen Etzen. Let me just point this to the front.
There we go. I'll get back to the title. Thank you, Antonio, and thank you, everyone, for having me here to this conference. I have to say that being here feels familiar in some ways. I actually grew up in a small town in California, except it was smaller than El Centro and further from any major commercial center like San Diego. So I do appreciate what you have here and how loyal and important it is to you that you are here. I also feel familiar with this area because of my career. As Antonio mentioned, I did considerable work on geothermal industries as a young professional. First at the Geysers, on development of several plants there while on the California Energy Commission, and then later as a consultant. And as a consultant, I did considerable work with the geothermal developers here in Imperial County, who built, as I think you all know, I think probably the first in the country, utility-scale geothermal by non-utility developers. And I just want to acknowledge that because I think the renewable industry here today really stands on the shoulders of those early developers of that industry here in Imperial County. And Imperial County deserves considerable credit for the success of those projects and the foundation that provided for the vibrant renewable industry that exists today in California. Let me just start by giving you a little background on the California Independent System Operator. I know a number of you are familiar with this, but some may not be. The California ISO is, the I in ISO is independent. So we're a nonprofit entity. We have no commercial interest in the work that we do, and we're governed by an independent board. The ISO is represented on this map by the green colored area. So we have most of California, other than IID, LA, and Sacramento Municipal Utility Districts. There are a few others as well that aren't part of us. We've recently added a part of southwestern Nevada to our balancing authority, so municipal utility, rural co-op in that area that found benefit by coming into the California ISO. We have about nearly 60,000 megawatts of installed capacity in our system. And our record peak, you may all remember this, back in 2006 was over 50,000 megawatts. With regard to how we're overseen, I mentioned that we are governed by a board of governors. That's a board that's appointed by the governor of California and confirmed by the California State Senate. So it's a very California-based governance system. We are, though, regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. We operate under a tariff that governs how we interconnect generation, our market rules for how we optimize the system, and how we dispatch and settle those transactions. all of that is under the federal regulatory framework. And like IID, we are a balancing authority, and we must remain compliant with NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. I'm sure you're all aware that in recent years, what used to be kind of recommended reliability standards have become mandatory, and we're now all subject to these matters as mandatory compliance, and we're subject to fines in the event we don't satisfy those requirements. And then lastly, we are all part of the Western Electric Coordinating Council and participate actively in WEC. What I want to do is take you a little bit through some of the things we see at the California ISO, and then conclude with what some of the coming issues are, and some of the current and coming issues, I should say. We have seen just in July 2011, so just 2 years ago, we had nearly 70,000 megawatts of renewable generation, mostly, some conventional as well, but mostly renewable. This is just showing the renewable, I guess. 70,000 megawatts in our interconnection process. Well, that was, as you might imagine, an impossible thing to have occur. Our entire peak load is 50,000 megawatts, and the way that we have to study these things and identify interconnection requirements to ensure that they all interconnect reliably. These are the same things that IID must do locally here in your interconnection process. It really created a big challenge to how to do this work responsibly and in a timely fashion. So we've gone through a number of reforms of our process, which has become considerably streamlined over the last several years, including we call it, speaking of the word cluster, that's the last panelist used, we study projects in clusters that are electrically related to one another, and that's helped us accelerate our work. We are still, though, in a situation where we have about 35,000 megawatts in the system, and as this chart indicates, an incremental need to meet 33% of just over 10,000. So there is still a lot of interest. You know, many of the projects that have come through the queue successfully will not be successful, frankly. I just think it's an unfortunate reality that the permitting and transmission issues associated with project development are complicated and in some cases quite expensive. But there's a lot of activity and a lot of very good work being done by people here and elsewhere in California. This slide shows you where these projects are. So just to orient you, the bubbles are in kind of aggregate ways, the areas where we do the transmission interconnection studies, how we group these projects. And each of these, the size of the bubble gives you an indication of the amount of generation in the area. And you look overall, we have, when you add the conventional in, then we go from 35,000 megawatts to nearly 50,000 megawatts in our interconnection queue. We have in Imperial County, this is a county by county listing. It's available on our website if you want to look at this more carefully. But we do have 13 projects in Imperial County, and 2,300 megawatts of renewable generation. So there is still considerable interest here. These are projects interconnecting with the California ISO. IID has additional projects interconnecting with IID. So those projects would be in addition to the ones that I've reflected in these numbers. And of course, when these projects come through, either through our interconnection process or IID's interconnection process, there is work between us to make sure that we're consulting with one another and understanding what the implications for their balancing authority and ours. So this brings me to my last slide, and before I move into these issues, I understand that a couple of issues have come up earlier in the day, and I want to make sure I touch on them as well. And let me just start with the San Onofre. These are kind of current things happening. The San Onofre Nuclear Generating Station. We're all aware that this is 2,200 megawatts of the 58,000 megawatts of installed capacity in the California ISO. Both of the nuclear units are out of service, and it's, I think, highly uncertain when they'll come back, or perhaps even if they will come back. It is a large amount of generation, and it's also a generation that's in a very critical part of the system. It's right between the San Diego and Edison balancing authorities, and each of those areas represent what we call a local constrained area, which means there are transmission constraints for delivering the energy into that area. So unfortunately, that means that additional generation here really doesn't help with that outage, because we have to plan the system so that there's adequate generation in that kind of constrained area to meet those local needs. The other thing I wanted to touch on was our energy imbalance market. As you may know, we put an offer forward last year in February, and put forward a proposal which we intentionally made very kind of low cost of entry, quite scalable, and easy exit. So we have an imbalanced market in the California ISO. We have systems that dispatch generation every 5 minutes and optimizes the generation across our entire footprint, taking into account all the transmission constraints and the cost of the generation alternatives, and dispatch this to achieve the 5-minute balancing services that we need. So we don't have to build a new platform. We've got it, which allows us to offer this service at a very competitive price, frankly. So PacifiCorp, as you know, is about a 10,000 megawatt system across 6 states in the Northwest. PacifiCorp and the ISO have entered into an agreement to implement such a market. Our Board of Governors takes this up next week at their meeting. And for them, the cost of this, of coming into this system based on the proposal we put forward last year, so again, they're a 10,000 megawatt system, is just over $2 million. And then they will pay an ongoing fee based on usage and based on our transparent and published grid management charge for the services that we provide. There's no exit fee if they change their mind. If they come in and try it and don't like it, they can walk away with no charge. And there's nothing about this proposal that touches on their balancing authority responsibility. So they still have complete control over their system and their compliance with federal requirements, their participation in reserve sharing with the Northwest Power Pool. So we think it's an important value for the West to be able to achieve this quicker dispatch and the greater renewable integration that can result from it. The other 3 items I wanted to touch on were the competitive transmission opportunities that are arising now through our transmission planning process. We have developed, I think the first in the country, competitive mechanism for transmission developers to come in and compete to build projects with the investor and utility service providers. And these opportunities arise in the case of 2 kinds of projects. If a project is policy driven, and that generally means it's a project that's driven by California's renewable portfolio standards. Every year we get recommended portfolios from the California Energy Commission and the California Public Utilities Commission that tell us where they think the renewables should develop to achieve the 33% renewables, and we do the transmission planning around that. So when that triggers transmission, there are some constraints. I mean, if you're talking about an upgrade on existing poles, it gets a little more complicated, but that triggers transmission for those needs. There is a competitive opportunity for people to build it. The other competitive opportunity arises for economic projects. So if in our studies we identify transmission upgrades that are based on providing net benefits to the customers of California, then that as well is subject to a competitive process. The projects that are not subject to that process are reliability upgrades on the existing system of the investor and utilities. And I think many of you probably know that IID has such a project and is competing to build. It's a small project, but it's an important one, helping consolidate cross-canal interconnections and I think improve the interaction between us and IID in many ways. So we're pleased by that and look forward to the conclusion of that process. I think it's expected in the April timeframe. And I'll just note that there could also be additional competitive opportunities because we are absolutely committed at the request of the state, and I think just inherently to make sure that we maintain the kind of export capability from Imperial Valley into the rest of California in support of the state's renewable objectives and in the support of the policies of this area as well. So we're doing that, and in the event we find additional transmission that can reinforce that and enhance that, that's the kind of project that could well be subject to this competitive opportunity. So I wanted to make sure that you were aware of that possibility as well. Thank you very much. Appreciate being here.
Thank you for your comments, Ms. Edson. Appreciate that. Next, we have David McIntyre. Mr. McIntyre is a seasoned project manager with 22 years of private sector and Department of Defense experience. He is a manager of Ecology and Environment's Tucson office and has a leading role in E&E's Geothermal Energy Support Program. He has led many successful EIS and environmental planning efforts, including the West Chocolate Mountain Renewable Energy Evaluation Area, EIS, and the Truck Haven Geothermal Leasing, EIS, in Imperial County. He has facilitated collaborative planning efforts for a variety of high-profile projects requiring evaluation under NEPA and CEQA. Ecology and Environment is a recognized global leader in environmental management and has not only a large domestic presence, but a large global presence as well. So let us welcome Mr. McIntyre.
Thank you. I put this presentation together about 2 or 3 weeks ago and thought it was pretty good and figured that I would have a chance to touch it up as time went on, and then I looked last Friday and it was about 4 o'clock and I realized I needed to get this to Antonio. So I looked at it again earlier this week and I was wondering what made me think that it was so good 3 weeks ago, what had changed. So I will endeavor not to bore you with too much NEPA-ese or environmental discussion. Well, that's where I wanted to be anyway. Actually, no. So the project that I want to talk about is an environmental impact statement and a proposed California Desert Conservation Area Plan Amendment that looks at evaluating the environmental impacts of allocating federal mineral estate for geothermal resource development and allocating federal surface estate for solar and wind energy development through the right-of-way process. One of the decisions that was addressed in the EIS was whether to designate our project area, which we call the West Chocolate Mountain Renewable Energy Evaluation Area, as a solar energy zone, similar to what the BLM solar programmatic document was doing with other solar energy zones. Whether to approve or deny an existing non-competitive geothermal lease application that was already present within our project area, and whether to implement a renewable energy development cap. And I want to just go back here real quick, if I can. Our project area is essentially sandwiched between the Chocolate Mountain Aerial Gunnery Range and the Salton Sea, north of Niland and east of Calipatria. We started on the project in 2009, and as a consultant, the happiest day of your life is the day you win a big project, and then the next happiest day of your life is when you wrap that big project up. So we started in about 2009, and the final EIS was delivered and opened to the public the 1st of December of 2012. So 3 years long, not as long as others, not as short as we'd like it to be. We looked at 5 what we called action alternatives, along with a no action. The no action was no plan amendment and no approval of the non-competitive lease. We actually had another no action that actually would amend the CDCA plan, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, but there would be no lease approval. We had a renewable energy development emphasis alternative that allowed wind, solar, and geothermal. We had a geothermal-only development alternative, a solar energy development emphasis and moderate geothermal development alternative, And then the preferred was geothermal development, emphasis with moderate solar. Quite a range of alternatives, and this was the BLM's preferred alternative. The first one, under the no action, no project, there would be no amendment to the CDCA plan. The land would remain available provisionally for geothermal leasing and solar and wind energy development. Any future applications would be addressed under NEPA, and if there was a plan amendment required, as there probably would be for a utility scale project, it would be done at that time. The non-competitive lease application would not be approved, and then there would be no solar energy zone designation and no renewable energy development cap. Under the no action with a plan amendment, the plan would actually be amended to identify our renewable energy evaluation areas closed to geothermal, solar, and wind energy development. And then similarly to the other no action, the lease would not be approved, no SES, and no energy development cap. Our development emphasis alternative, we were going to identify the entire area as open and suitable to geothermal, solar, and wind. One of the things that we did fairly early on was we developed reasonably foreseeable development scenarios to try to determine how much geothermal potential there was and how much wind and solar potential there was, and that they became the basis to estimate what the impact would be under the different alternatives. So this particular alternative assumed that there would be the maximum amount developed as described in those RFDs. We worked with NREL actually and did some modeling just to try to predict the solar potential as accurately as possible. The existing lease application that I mentioned would be approved under this alternative. Our project area would be designated as a solar energy zone, and we would have an energy development cap on all the BLM land located east of the Coachella Canal that was within our project area. We then had the geothermal only alternative. Again, it would identify our area as suitable for geothermal energy development, and it would close it to wind and solar. We would develop geothermal to the maximum extent defined in our scenario, and then the same as the previous alternative for the lease application, the SES, and the development cap. Now this is a long title. The solar energy development emphasis with moderate geothermal development and no wind development alternative. That's a mouthful, and I read that every day for a long time. Under this, we would identify the area as suitable for solar and geothermal, but closed to and unsuitable for wind. We would develop solar, theoretically solar would be developed to the maximum extent as defined in their scenario, and geothermal would be developed to the moderate extent. And the existing lease application in the solar energy zone would be approved, and the development cap would be installed. And then the last one, the geothermal energy development emphasis with moderate solar development and no wind. And you'll notice that in everything but the maximum emphasis development, wind was not allowed. So we would amend it to allow geothermal and solar in our evaluation area, closed to wind. Geothermal will be developed to the maximum extent possible, and solar would be developed, and I think I got those switched up, I'm sorry about that, would be developed to the moderate level. Lease application will be approved. The Coachella Canal on the west side would be, or the east side would be designated as a solar energy zone. Or I'm sorry, on the west side, I think it's correct. So we released the draft EIS to the public on July 1st, 2011. Public comment period of 90 days. Got comments from the public, primarily on biological issues and water supply, because obviously geothermal and solar thermal are water-intensive uses. Got comments from the Fish and Wildlife Service, primarily related to obviously related to biological resources, specifically about the desert tortoise, which was east of the Coachella Canal, and other concerns about federally listed species like the Least-Bill's vireo, Yuma clapperel, willow flycatcher. And then we got comments from the Department of Defense who were concerned about wind turbines adjacent to the Chocolate Mountain Area Gunnery Range. I don't know why they would be concerned about flying around wind turbines, but they are, tongue in cheek. And then they were concerned about heat signature potential off-site, off their reservation. So we did do some revisions to the final EIS based on the comments that we got from the public and from the agencies. We created a development cap of no more than 10% of the BLM land east of the Coachella Canal, essentially to kind of disincentivize development in that area. and to incentivize development west of the canal. We identified formally stipulations that would be applied to solar or geothermal energy development, included them in the EIS. We put restrictions on development in proximity to certain to hydrologic features. And we placed restrictions on development in proximity to certain special status species. The DRECP obviously is still in development. The solar programmatic EIS was ahead of us. The solar programmatic record of decision was released about 45 days prior to our document coming out, and we wanted to follow behind it as much as we could. And we adopted their mitigation measures and BMPs as part of our document. And again, our evaluation area was designated a solar energy zone. It was not a solar energy zone in the solar programmatic. It wasn't ours. And the DRECP EIS, EIR, which is currently in progress, our project is located within their study area. We adopted their draft mitigation measures and BMPs that were put out a couple of years ago by the Renewable Energy Action Team. And the BLM has been internally coordinating, the BLM from our team has been internally coordinating with the DRECP team so that we don't have a conflicting document. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, David. You will be fielding all our environmental questions then, because it seems you have lots to share with us. So next on our panel, we have Commissioner Carla Peterman. Carla Peterman is currently a commissioner with the California Public Utilities Commission, but served as a former commissioner as well as of the California Energy Commission. She is the current chair of the Plug-in Electric Vehicle Collaborative, and she was appointed to the PUC by Governor Brown in 2011. I'm sorry, that was the appointment to the Energy Commission, but was recently, again, reappointed now to the PUC, also by Governor Jerry Brown. At the Energy Commission, Peterman was a lead commissioner for renewables, transportation, and the Independent Energy Policy Report. Commissioner Peterman has conducted research at the University of California Energy Institute and also served on the board of directors for the Utility Reform Network from 2008 through 2011. So with that, let us welcome Commissioner Peterman.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today is officially my 2-month anniversary in the new role, and it's great to spend it with you and to see all of you in this new capacity. I was pleased to be invited to this forum, and as I went through the agenda, I was happy to note that many of the names were familiar. Indeed, on the last panel, I've had the opportunity to visit and work with all the companies and organizations. And it really does show you that Imperial Valley companies are making an impact and getting an audience in Sacramento and San Francisco, and I continue to encourage you to do so. As was noted, I'm currently a commissioner with the Public Utilities Commission. The Public Utilities Commission has regulatory oversight over the investor-owned electric, gas, water utilities, as well as telecommunications, as well as responsibility for safety as it relates to railway, transit, and taxis. I'll focus today on the work that the PUC is doing on renewables, but happy to talk about any of these topics generally. The PUC regulates the 3 investor-owned utilities in the state: Pacific Gas and Electric, San Diego Gas and Electric, and Southern California Edison, and these represent 68% of the state's retail sales. At the base of our renewable work is the state's Renewable Portfolio Standard, which is one of the most aggressive and successful renewable standards in the country. And I'm happy to report that our utilities are on track for meeting this target. The investor-owned utilities have a goal for 2016 to procure 25% of their energy from renewables and 33% by 2020. Since 2003, right after the investor-owned utilities first had a renewable standard, Since then, we've developed 4,500 megawatts of new renewable capacity, over 2 times what we have with San Onofre, and so it's really good to see that progress. Imperial Valley represents a noticeable share of that new capacity. 7% of new investor-owned utility renewable procurement that came online in 2012 was in the Imperial Valley, and 14% of generation expected to come online in 2013 will also be from the Imperial Valley. Some of these projects are the ones that you toured earlier today, if you had the opportunity. Just to name a few: Centinela Solar, 110 megawatts, solar PV, due to be online in 2014. Mount Signal 1 Solar Farm, 150 megawatts, 2013. The Oxiello Express Wind Project, probably obliterated that name, 265 megawatts, due to be online in 2013. And San Diego Gas and Electric is the purchaser for all of these different projects. So indeed, even though we are sitting in one of the publicly owned utility districts, there is a true connection to our investor-owned utilities and the Public Utility Commission's work. In addition to the Renewable Portfolio Standard, we manage a mix of programs to bring renewables of different sizes, customer side, and wholesale online. These, in particular, some of the other programs we have are the Renewable Auction Mechanism, referred to as the RAM, the Feed-in Tariff, the California Solar Initiative, and the Self-Generation Incentive Program. I'll offer a couple comments on these because over half the contracts that the Public Utility Commission signed this year or in 2012 for renewables were for some of these smaller projects, and indeed we're seeing a tremendous growth in these areas. The Renewable Auction Mechanism provides competitive contracts for wholesale distributed generation up to 20 megawatts. And some positives we're seeing with this program include quick project development times and the capture of recent declines in technology prices. The feed-in tariff, which was revised by recent legislation, SB 32, incentivizes projects 3 megawatts or less. And with the passage of SB 32, the feed-in tariff now expands to our publicly owned utilities in addition to our investor-owned. There was a discussion of biogas in the last panel, and one of the areas that I work on at the Commission is biogas. So I'll just note that we're currently working on the implementation of legislation 1122, which requires the investor-owned utilities through a feed-in tariff to procure 250 megawatts of bioenergy projects. And there's specific megawatts required from different technology types, specifically wastewater treatment, digester gas, and landfill gas. We're also working on implementing AB 1900, which will facilitate the injection of landfill gas in particular into the natural gas pipelines. So I think we're seeing a lot of activity in that space, particularly in the regulatory arena. Overall, the generation mix for the Renewable Portfolio Standard is shifting. Cumulatively, currently the portfolio is dominated by wind and geothermal, wind representing 38% and geothermal 34%. We project that by 2020, we'll see the shift from wind and geothermal to solar PV and solar thermal, representing 34%, that's PV, and 13% for solar thermal, respectively. There will still remain a role for biopower, hydro, and wind, but we're not seeing those technologies projected to grow as much as the others. We're continuously working to improve the programs, and a significant amount of work is going into reform of the Renewable Portfolio Standard. Commissioner Farron at the Commission is leading on some of these activities, but generally we're focusing on streamlining the RPS contract review process, increasing transparency of the review of procurement, clearer standards for review, and quantification of local benefits of DG. Indeed, we're seeing renewables move from being a small part of the portfolio to increasingly starting to dominate, and that means that there's some work we can do to make the process more streamlined. So I will conclude with that, but I look forward to your questions and to working with you in my new capacity. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. And finally, we have Dr. Robert Weisenmiller, Chairman of the California Energy Commission. Dr. Weisenmiller was appointed to the California Energy Commission by Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger in January of 2010, and then reappointed by Governor Brown in January of 2011. In February of 2011, he was subsequently appointed chair of the commission. He fills the engineer-scientist position on the 5-member Board of Commissioners. Chair Weisenmiller brings more than 30 years of energy experience to the commission, including expertise in electricity and gas markets and California regulatory policies. Chair Weisenmiller has served as an expert witness in more than 100 state and federal regulatory commission proceedings and has authored numerous publications on electricity and natural gas markets. So let us welcome also Chair Weisenmiller.
I guess as a scientist engineer, I'll point out that we are in the 3rd month, the 14th day, so this is Happy Pi Day. Really? Okay. As he indicated, I am the chair of the Energy Commission. The Energy Commission was set up in roughly almost 40 years ago. The legislation was signed by then Governor Reagan, and it was implemented then by Governor Brown. I had the honor of serving as a staffer in that first Brown administration, and now I've returned to become the chair in the second Brown administration. In those roles, I also served with Karen Edson when she was commissioner, and Commissioner Peterman when she was also an energy commissioner. So it's good to be reunited here. In terms of the Energy Commission, just giving a little context before I get into my talk, we have a variety of responsibilities. One of the things we do is site any thermal power plant that's over 50 megawatts. And one of the things that in my first year working with Michael Picker and others, we managed to site over 4,000 megawatts of 9 solar thermal projects, which was certainly a historic achievement. One of the things we learned from that is location really matters. And so you heard earlier this morning from Scott Flint about the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan, which is based upon that work, trying to figure out how to guide development into locations which will have minimal impacts, and how to guide development away from areas which should be conservation opportunities. Along with siting, we do planning for the state. We do every other year a major report on energy policy, and then in the alternate year, we do a more minor version of that. One of the things I'm going to talk about today is some of the conclusions of our last report. We're responsible for research and development. We have a program that, again, does a lot of R&D on a variety of things, everything from smart grids. Certainly you heard about the UC San Diego and the microgrid there. We help fund that. Other things we're doing now down there at UC San Diego is also helping to fund basically much better weather forecasting for solar and wind, which then builds into tools that the Cal ISO can use in its system. So again, we have a very, along with renewables, certainly energy efficiency, certainly transportation. We have a separate program on transportation that looks at alternative fuels and transportation technology. That's what that was set up by the 118 bill, AB 118, that's up for reauthorization. Certainly a lot of what you've heard on biofuels earlier, or what you've heard on electric cars or hydrogen, are things that we have been working with people on there. So again, that's a very important program. We're certainly looking for reauthorization. Encourage everyone to be part of that. Energy efficiency. Since 1978, we've been doing building and appliance standards. For building standards for new construction, variety of appliances. We will have new building standards go into effect at the end of this year or starting next year, which will reduce energy consumption by 25% relative to our last round of building standards in 2009. Also next year, if the federal government doesn't preempt us, we will put in place battery charger standards. If you look around your household, you will find roughly 11 battery chargers. And many of these have designs which would be as if you were standing at the pump at a gasoline station and did not stop when you fill up the tank, but just keep pouring the gas out on the ground. And so you can feel the inefficient ones, battery chargers, where they just get hotter and hotter. So basically, again, we have a simple switch to turn them off when your battery's charged. But again, trying to figure out 10 years from now how many battery chargers you're going to have, it's really important to do smart things like that. Similarly, it's really important to build housing right from the start so we don't have to go back and try to retrofit it later. We also do contingency planning. Certainly one of the first time I met the governor in Brown 1 was we were dealing with shortages of gasoline in lines at the service stations. We also do renewables. Again, Commissioner Peterman worked on that. She worked on transportation. But on renewables, we're responsible for trying to make sure that what is claimed to be renewable really is. That to the extent we're providing subsidies, we're going to make sure the stuff is really green. And in addition, we're responsible for looking at the POU, our RPS programs. The PUC looks at the IOUs. Our programs are not nearly as intrusive as the IOU, as the PUC relationship with the IOUs, but certainly it's important to the legislature that all of our utilities are being greened. Along with that, I would note that I am the state's representative to state liaison to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, so San Onofre has certainly been a big issue for me the last couple of years. And certainly on a lot of the policy fronts, we've worked very closely with the PUC and the ISO and the Air Resources Board. I would note that President Peavy and I both sent a letter to the Cal ISO on Friday supporting the energy balance market. And indeed, saying that should become something which we want to see not just statewide, but westwide. So looking at renewables, when the governor put together his energy plan, he framed it as a jobs plan. And certainly when I came back into state service, it was to deal with the twin challenges California faced at that point. One of them was jobs. One of my first week, I was at a siting hearing down at Blythe. 30% unemployment. We felt that it was critical to get jobs for our citizens, to give people opportunities. And so one of the things that really important was to use renewable energy, use the transformation of our energy system as a way to provide new opportunities for California, and particularly to move the innovation out of our universities out into businesses and to create jobs. So like one of the things I've worked closely with UC San Diego is to take the microgrid concept, move it onto the military bases, move it out from the universities, make it businesses, make those businesses provide jobs for California, and at the same time enhancing the security and reliability of the power needs that the bases get. So again, jobs is a key thing. It was really encouraging today to see all the efforts coming to bear here, because again, we really have put a premium on trying to help areas like Imperial Valley on the jobs front. I would say I'm approached by people from other states, Nevada, New Mexico, Wyoming, all the time saying, I'm here to help you. I can help you get to 33% renewable cheaper and faster if you just buy into a new big transmission line. And I've had to tell them, first, we're going to get there. We're going to go past 33% with the commitments we have already. I tend to think that the projects, we talked today about 33% assumes like a 40% contract failure rate. I think the projects are going to do better than that. They're certainly looking at what's under construction. I wouldn't be surprised if we don't get to 40, frankly, with the existing commitments. So I've been telling them, we don't need your help. We certainly would like to work as part of a broad network in the West, but we really have been trying to encourage development down here. Now, so we really want to work together on that, but that's a two-way street. We have to work together. Other thing that really motivates the governor along with jobs is climate change. Again, I'm the scientist on the commission, and I want to make it clear to people first, it's really happening now. It's not a hypothetical. And my examples, if you go to Scripps, Scripps at the end of the pier has been measuring the temperature every day since 1915. And they can tell you the sea temperature is 2 degrees hotter than it was. They can also tell you they've been sampling what's in the water there, and it's different than it was. That basically, if you were there in the 50s, you had abalone. And beyond overfishing it, it's too warm for abalone there now. So that's a change. It's happened. Or similarly, if you look at our temperatures across the state, since 1890 till now, it's 1.7 degrees hotter than it was. So again, it's happening now. Another example is fires. It used to be in California that once a decade we'd have a horrible fire. If you look at the top 20 worst fires we've had, 10 of them have been in the last 10 years. Again, what's happening is it's getting hotter, it's getting drier, that's stressing our forest and resulting in fire hazards and worse fires. So again, the basic message is it's happening now. It's certainly going to get much worse if you look at our projections of what's likely to happen over the next 10 years. We see loads statewide being over 1,000 megawatts higher at peak because of higher temperatures. That's 10 years. We see snowpack in the mountains, sort of, again, shifting out of that very variable time in August, and much less snowpack there. We see a hotter, drier California, which again results in fire hazards. We have fire hazards around some of our transmission lines, really leading into California from the north and also leading into Los Angeles. We really have to look serious. We also see worse winter storms. Sea levels higher, but also the storms will again be having a more severe impact. So certainly the coastal areas, we need to identify the critical infrastructure that's being affected in our energy systems. We have to look at mitigation, which is pretty much energy efficiency, reducing our fossil fuel use through energy efficiency and renewables. And we also have to look at adaptation and readiness. You know, we've seen what's happened back east with Sandy. We've seen what happened, you know, I'm afraid some of the normal climate things that occur every year, all the time, are now on steroids and having much worse impact. So the answer is we really have to move seriously on dealing with these issues, not just in power, but certainly transportation. So looking at the Renewable Action Plan, Commissioner Peterman and I had I directed sort of an IPER that looked at what were the major status and issues of renewables, and she assisted me on that. And then the subsequent year, she then built off of that to look at what our actions should be, and came up with the Renewable Action Plan. And so again, I'm going to summarize this. I'm sure I looked at the staff, I'm using the staff presentations, but I'm sure she'll correct me if my summary is not quite right. But anyway, so what we did is we looked at it and we said, okay, and we looked very much in that first one at utility scale renewables, and frankly, we looked some at distributed gen, and what I tend to say is we understand much better the consequences and the opportunities of utility scale than we do on DG. And so different sets of issues we can talk about a little bit. But first of all, it was really important to identify and prioritize geographical areas for renewable development. Again, this came out of our siting experience that location really matters. From an environmental perspective, it certainly really matters from a transmission perspective. We also looked at the need to really evaluate the cost and benefits of renewables. Because of all the contract negotiation stuff, you know, a lot of us don't have the numbers. The PUC certainly has the numbers, and they're slowly rolling out, but there are both costs and benefits. It was really important to minimize interconnection cost and time at the transmission and distribution level. Again, just looking at the charts that Edson shown on the interconnection queues, that certainly people were very frustrated on getting through those queues, trying to get their projects online. In terms of, we also wanted to really provide incentives for in-state jobs and economic benefits. Again, we really would prefer to see the development areas like Imperial Valley as opposed to, say, New Mexico or Wyoming. Well, having said that, you know, there's some diversity benefits of having wind machines both in California and Wyoming. But again, we really see this as part of our economic development strategy. And we also looked at promoting and coordinating financing and incentive programs for critical skills. I mean, everyone knows that the stuff only can happen if you can achieve financing, if you can do financing quicker or more cost effectively. Presumably that will reduce the cost. Okay, so based upon looking at what the status and issues were, then, like I said, last year there was a very detailed evaluation of what are the renewable action plan, what are the principles. And so, again, first thing we looked at was the notion of we really needed to start shifting our resource planning from conventional utility focus to much more renewable centric. And we needed to do it in ways that maximize the benefits and minimize the cost and risk. But it's a new world. Looking at where we're going, certainly there's no stopping. We're going forward to progressively greater levels of renewables. And so we need to, that really requires a transformation in our utility system, our planning, and certainly our regulatory system. And again, we really wanted to position California for higher renewable targets. And I guess talk about that for a second. One of the things we want to do is maximize the benefits for California of renewables over the next 20 years. And so we anticipate costs going down. So we don't want to buy it all right now. We want to be doing a phased development, and we also don't want the industry to go through a boom and bust cycle, but instead to spread this out. And so to start thinking through how do we position our systems for greater renewable penetration, but again, to try to be smart. And, and frankly, one of the issues we're dealing with or thinking through, where again the ISO is more at the forefront on, is what do we need to do to really integrate the renewables into our system and to respond to the fact that the winds are particularly highest at night and come down just as the loads are going up, just as the sun's going up and the load's going down, and at the same time the sun will start setting and the production from solar will start setting just as our loads start ramping up in the evening. And at this point we're concerned we could even have a double peak, a morning peak, the sun depressing the loads down, and then sort of a real sharp spike in the late afternoon. And that's on the utility scale. When you get to the DG, there's not the same sort of visibility. A lot of that's along the coast, so you have the coastal fog. And so again, the ISO may just see loads popping up and down and wondering what's going on. So basically trying to get the tools we need to maintain a reliable system, at the same time integrating increasing levels of renewables in. We're trying to figure out, obviously, we're generally trying to rely on the markets, but what are the gaps and how do we deal with those gaps? We're also trying to really recognize the connection between the actions. And again, our electricity planning, it's really necessary to start, and presumably you're more at the forefront on this, but connecting utility planning with local planning. And, again, we often look at this thing and say, here's PG&E. PG&E's vast, or, Edison's vast. San Diego is smaller, but again, and we tend to talk about what's going on in the overall service territory, while in fact the decisions, particularly for distributed gen, are occurring at the local level. So we have to somehow translate this utility service area type of thinking down to the local government. We need to be looking at not just where do things fit best on the utility transmission or distribution system, but where does it best fit with the local planning, And so that's again requires, I think the governor framed it best by saying, we know with the 1,000 megawatt projects what to do, but as we start moving for 1,001 megawatt projects, there's a lot more decisions that have to occur at the local level, and we need to all work together on that. In terms of, we really need to work on the financing, promoting the sort of clean energy investments. We need to really worry about cost. Again, if we can do things smarter and get the cost down, that's better. One of the things I want to talk about for a second, and basically we developed this, I should say we, again, give most of the credit to Commissioner Peterman, was a series of workshops. We had 7 public workshops. We developed a draft. We then reached out to all the other state agencies to get general buy-in so that You often hear the need for better coordination in California. Well, actually, you hear a number of myths. One myth is obviously you can't permit anything in California. Well, we destroyed that myth. You can't build anything in California. We weren't going to hit 20%. And so those are gone. The new myth is obviously state government is not well coordinated. Again, that's wrong. And then the other part of the myth is that we don't have a plan. Well, we do. So to sort of walk through the plan, and there's a more detail, but one of the things that we really tried to focus on, and again, collectively, more credit to Commissioner Peterman and myself, was to say, what do you need to do first? What are the top priority? Not just here's the 30 action items, but what do we need to do now? And so one of the things we did, just sort of dropping to the bottom, was to say, look, the federal government was considering extensions of the production tax credit. And that's very, very important. We know the state has its challenges financially, but if we can get some more subsidies on that side to counterbalance oil and gas subsidies, it was important to do that now and to sort of reach into the federal process. That's been adopted, but I think as we discussed earlier, the decision-making now on what constitutes 5% is critical. So we know we have to really try to influence that to make that most effective for California. Again, sort of starting at the top now, one is, again, it's very important to identify the preferred geographic areas. And that's, again, working with people in California to say, looking at local planning, looking at transmission and distribution systems, where is the most value from additional development? And of course, part of that is looking at, well, what about the economic benefits? So we'd like to really work with areas which are more economically challenged, but at the same time, as I said, we have to work together on that. We also want to maximize the value through the assessment. So one of the things which we were concerned about, although again, we see these shifts, when we do our personal investments, we always want a portfolio. And so the question is, what sort of portfolio do we want of the renewable projects? And the utilities have typically procured renewables at the least cost, best fit, whatever that means. But we're saying that means each auction, but we're now seeing a real dominance there of photovoltaics, and which have the intermittent nature, which lead to some of the renewable questions, although they're particularly low cost. So the question is that the best portfolio for us? Or what sort of mixture of resources do we want? And presumably in this area, that gets to the question of why not more geothermal? The other thing was to say, frankly, part of the question we had there was looking more at the cost of renewable integration as part of the solicitations. The other thing we talked about was looking at our rate designs, electric rate designs. And again, I guess this issue sort of followed Commissioner Peterman. Now she gets to not just talk about it, but actually deal with it. But anyway, the reality is if you look at someplace like, well, in our commercial industrial area, we have fixed charges or variable cost. And in the residential sector, it's volumetric and a very complicated tier system. And the tier system is particularly, parts of it were frozen by the legislature. The first two tiers would be relatively low, and the subsequent tiers are quite high. So that means if you're living out here and you were an Edison customer and you have very high heating load or cooling loads, then you'd be paying fairly high bills. You'd be in the third or fourth tier, and presumably photovoltaics will look remarkably attractive to you. Well, if you're living in the coastal area, even if you had much higher income, any number of things, you're presumably much more likely to be in those very low-cost first two tiers, which are not even covering average cost. And so there's a real push in as we're asking utilities to make more investments in the transmission and distribution system. And part of that, frankly, is that a lot of our utility systems really expanded in that post-Korean War era. And so you're looking at 50-year-old cables, poles, transformers, all kinds of stuff which we will need to replace in the next 10 years. And we need to replace that with smart technology. But that means that there are really fixed costs that utilities incur as part of providing electric service. And at least under the current rate designs, which have other problems, if you are going with photovoltaics and you're going with net metering, you're not necessarily paying your fair share of those costs. In terms of minimizing strategy 3 was minimizing interconnection integration cost. So again, one of the things was to consider environmental and land use factors in renewable scenarios, which gets back to DRECP and gets back to the effort again Karen Edson noticed where we, the Energy Commission and PUC, are combining the Energy Commission's land use planning with the PUC's procurement activities to then provide transmission scenarios for the ISO to build a system around, so that we are again trying to encourage development in areas which have more reduced environmental impacts. We really need to start looking at distribution planning and the opportunities there to really integrate distribution DG into distribution planning and try to identify the sites that have the most value on the system. In terms of basically, we also need some sort of forward procurement mechanism. And again, what we looked at is California has sort of a mixed market where we have long-term contracts that basically the PUC will do an RFP. A lot of gas projects, say about 10,000 megawatts, got basically 10-year contracts that covered, and those contracts are all structured so they had fixed cost and variable cost. And then we have more of the ISO's wholesale market, which is an energy-only market, which means if you're a gas plant, as more renewables come online, you're running less, which means you're getting less revenue. And so we see combined cycles, which people thought were going to run at 80%, which are now operating in the 30 to 50% range. And so they're going to maybe 300 starts a year. That's more stress on them. They're incurring more cost, but they're getting much less revenue. And so once they get past that initial contract, it's not obvious that they're going to be viable. And so we're talking about trying to come up with some mechanism that's maybe a 3 to 4 year market where they can cover their fixed cost. And so that's something. There was a very good symposium among the CalISO and PUC, which I participated in a couple weeks ago, where it gives a model of how the agencies are working. There's all three agencies there. I mean, it was very well staffed out. It was a very rich discussion. I think the issues were relatively clear. I think in terms of solutions and what we do next is certainly going to be complicated. But again, we just don't want to be in a situation where we build a new gas plant, run it for 10 years, it's no longer viable, and so we go out and build another gas plant for 10 years. But to try to, again, keep them they will provide the glue to our system on reliability, but they'll operate a lot less and a lot more stress. So we need to keep those assets around as we go forward, although we're obviously trying to, wean ourselves off of too high a dependence on gas. So it's finding the right mix there. In terms of one of the other things we're doing is basically to look at, to do that sort of regulation, again, as the ISO has seen wind in California drop close to 1,000 megawatts in a half-hour period, or to come up 1,000 megawatts in a half-hour period. Certainly the solar, as it sets, we are setting records each month on how much solar is coming into our system. But again, it goes down, in the evening, or it actually starts dropping off before you can get to peak. So as you're getting to, I guess it's 1,600 megawatts now of utility scale solar on our system, and that's now. It's not the summer. It's not when all the projects come online. That's going to drop off. So basically, being able to deal with those fluctuations, along with the normal load fluctuations or outages of plants or transmission lines. So the ISO really needs to define the types of products we need to deal with that and the amounts. So that's very important. Workforce training, worker training. I mean, again, we're looking at a new economy. We need to train our workforce for that. And it's very complicated. We have to figure out what sort of jobs, say, do you need in Pure Valley versus LA versus San Diego. But we have to, when I was up for confirmation that day in the Washington Post, there was an article about Fresno. And basically, Fresno had very high unemployment from the collapse of the construction industry, but they also had jobs that they could not fill, which were in the health industry. And so how do we retrain our workers to deal with the jobs that we're going to have in the future? Again, we cannot replicate that housing bubble we did the last time. So we need to be training people for the new jobs. And again, that's a challenge. And as I said, certainly one of the things we're also trying to do is research into renewables, particularly renewable integration. Things like, better tracking of better forecasting. If anything we can do to reduce the challenges of renewable integration, both on the distribution circuits and on the transmission circuits, again, is positioning California for the future. So that is the Renewable Action Plan. Again, very public process, a lot of stakeholder buy-in, and again, it lays out what our agenda is in this area. In this year's Independent Energy Policy Report, what we're trying to do under Commissioner McAllister is lay out a similar agenda in the area of energy efficiency and demand response, particularly for energy efficiency in terms of, again, new existing buildings. Most of the buildings in California have been around before the Energy Commission started its new standards. A lot of our energy is used there. A lot of it could be, these buildings, if we can figure out the right way to retrofit those cost effectively, can use a lot less energy. People can be a lot more comfortable. And again, that's certainly something we want to do in all areas, including areas here, where again, we know that this can be a pretty severe climate. So with that, happy to take any questions.
So again, if anyone has a question for our panelists this afternoon, please make sure you fill out a card, hold it up, and somebody, Mark maybe, will come around and deliver to me. But while we have those delivered, I have a question for each of the panelists. And the question, this is a regulatory panel. So the question that I have is, from your perspective, what is one regulatory policy that, if changed, would make energy projects in California easier to cite and permit? And whomever wants to take that one first.
Again, certainly the Energy Commission does its fair share of citing projects. And I think what we have tried to do is to look at how to be very clear. We have best management practice on stuff to basically, more projects are smart from the start, the easier it's going to be. And again, the more that people are picking locations which are where you want development to be as opposed to where you should have problems, again, it's going to take a lot longer. I mean, we had projects, we permitted in 9 months, solar thermal projects, and others took 34 months. And the ones that took 9 months, my favorite example is like the Rice Project. It's out at General Patton's old Air Force Base. When you visit the site, literally you just see the cement runways. There was no desert tortoise there by the time that we got there. And so it was a very easy siting project. So the more people can be smart on where they're going, and the less they just look at linearly, here's a highway, here's a transmission line, let's plop a project here, even if it has 300 cultural resources, or if it has, lots of desert tortoise or other species. So again, I think the system can work where we have now, but again, it's not, it really gets hung up where you have projects with high conflicts.
If you don't mind. Oh, goodness gracious. Karen, I have one that directly relates to that, so I'm going to follow up with that. In terms of getting a project finally cited and approved, if it's in the IOU territory, you have to go through both the Energy Commission citing process or a local citing process, and then you have to go through the PUC process to get approval for the economic contract and its reasonableness. And one can go through either process first. You can go through them in parallel. And one of the things that the PUC is currently working on, which I think could improve the process, is in its in our assessment of least cost, best fit of the economic viability of these contracts, including consideration of the environmental constraints in that analysis, so that you are considering whether there's a feasible chance that the project will get cited before you go through what can be a long and expensive process on the economic side with our agency.
One thing that I think at the ISO that we can do better, so let me just speak to that, is we can do a better job of understanding the commercial interests of the developers and the commercial needs you have as you bring a project to development. When you look at the timeline for development, the interconnection process occurs well before, in some cases, kind of depends on specific projects, but can begin well before a project is in a request for offer and competing for an actual power purchase agreement. One of the challenges we have is how to handle downsizing of projects as they approach commercial operation. It's something that we struggle with because in the interconnection process, we study the reliability upgrades necessary for that project to interconnect reliably. But I think we also are working on a way to bring some of those commercial interests to bear so that there is more flexibility. And I think we can do a better job of that, and we're working on it.
I think there's been a lot of discussion about CEQA reform and streamlining permitting, and I think one thing that could be done is, I don't know exactly how, but some type of regulation to eliminate the last-minute document dump that occurs against a lot of these projects, at the 11th hour, where someone who's opposed to the project, who's not previously voiced any dissent with it, comes in with a 10,000-page document of, what frankly is often vague and not, trying to think of the right word for the comment, but not a contributing what was it?
Constructive?
Yes, thank you. But it's just an attempt to slow down the project at the very end, and I think it's just undermining the whole system of what we're trying to do, what CEQA was intended to be.
So just then, a brief follow-up question. David, since you brought up the issue of CEQA reform, for the past 2 years in Sacramento, that has been a very hot topic, and Governor Brown himself has publicly stated that he would be in support of some type of CEQA reform, but the legislature has not proposed any type of reform package as of yet. Do you see that happening in 2013 or this session from your circles, that obviously on the environmental front maybe, or any of the other, if anybody else wants to jump in?
I haven't been following it that closely in the legislature, but yeah, I would venture to say I think there's going to be something in the next year or two. I would think, just based on what little I've seen.
Currently, there are a number of bills that in some way try to address CEQA reform, just like there are a few bills that have rate reform, but it's early on in the session, so let's see what emerges by mid-year. But there are a number of bills that are trying to address various aspects of what David was talking about.
I was just going to say, certainly that's a high priority for the governor. At the same point, I think it was Tuesday this week, there was some protest on those Capitol steps of various groups opposed to any CEQA reform. So we'll see what comes through.
Thank you. So we do have some questions from our audience. The first one is directed at Commissioner Peterman, and this is, can you elaborate on what the CPUC is doing to facilitate the addition and development of geothermal projects and geothermal energy?
Hello. So generally, as I was talking about, there are some efforts for reform of the least cost, best fit methodology, and one of the areas that the Commission is looking at, and particularly the lead commissioner on this, Commissioner Farron, is an evaluation of integration cost. And so it's always been of interest of mine, the all-in cost and benefits. And when you look at what resources we're seeing developed, you're seeing more intermittent resources, less base load like solar PV. So I think including an evaluation of integration cost would allow for some quantification and recognition of some of those the base load benefits of geothermal. But generally, the PUC's process is meant to be technology neutral. And in order to be technology neutral, though, we do need to make sure that we're quantifying and acknowledging all the benefits and costs each technology brings.
Okay. Thank you. moving on to another question from our audience, and this seems to be directed, it's about the IPER process, so Chairman Weisenmiller. When will preferred sites for DG, distributed generation projects, be identified via the IPER process, and how can the public access that information?
Actually, I was going to say what we proposed is that one of the things the Energy Commission has done over time has set up various stakeholder groups. Like one of them was Imperial Valley to come up with a plan here on transmission, another one for Tehachapi, and another broader looking at renewable energy technologies to the state. And so the way I look at it is we need a very broad stakeholder group looking at DG. And we need that group to really pull together the technology people, the developers, the local planners, the utilities, all the parties to come up with a way to basically have a plan there. Now, at the same time, the CalISO has gone through its system and tried to identify spots which basically have high value. And I think Karen Essen can talk about that. I believe the PUC has done some similar work on that. I think, again, Commissioner Peterman, and both of those are available on some level, and certainly the PUC has directed the IOUs to publish where the best spots or worst spots are. But again, what I think we need is a very broad-based stakeholder group to start coming to grips with what DG means overall. And that's a process which I'm hoping we get launched this year. It's going to take foundation support, a lot of work, and then it goes for a couple of years. But that's different from the more engineering aspects.
And I'll add on that the preferred areas for DG, the challenge is that they're constantly evolving and changing. So from a utility perspective, preferred area is an area where you don't have to do upgrades to the distribution system. And there are maps out there that say where those areas are. But if you see a rush of development to that area, suddenly that's an area that requires an upgrade. And so I think it's challenging because some folks have suggested having certain incentives for certain preferred areas. But again, once you do that and that no longer is the preferred area, it's pretty hard to pull back an incentive. And I also just wanted to add one more thing that relates to the geothermal, that even though the commission is technology neutral, there's an appreciation and recognition of the importance of certain attributes. And I really am supportive of an attribute-based approach. And within the RPS, there are 3 different attribute-based categories for procurement: baseload, peaking, and non-peaking. And so in theory, geothermal should be quite competitive in the baseload. The same thing with the renewable auction mechanism: peaking, non-peaking, and baseload. The reality, though, is that we're seeing little activity in some of the baseload categories in both the RPS as well as in the RAM, because projects still are not able to be competitive or even come online, particularly in geothermal. I think there's some economic challenges in doing some of the initial assessments of the resource itself. And there is a fund, Magurta Fund, which supports some of that funding for that research, which is administered through the Energy Commission. But still, it seems that there's challenges. And so I think we're facing the struggle of, we've heard there's a need for these products, but yet we're not seeing them come to light in our competitive process.
I'd like to comment on one of the challenges we have on the distributed generation side, and that is a lack of visibility to what's happening where. So in some cases, we can figure out how much rooftop solar there is only by watching how much the demand is in that area when the weather changes. That's not a very good way to be operating a reliable system. So one of the things that we're working to do with the Public Utilities Commission in their process is to make sure, hopefully we will be successful in getting greater visibility. It doesn't mean looking at every house, but it means having a way to aggregate what's installed on the distribution system to make sure that we can operate the higher voltage transmission system to maintain reliability.
Any other comments on this topic? All right, then we will move forward with our final question from the audience. There's about 5 minutes until our panel time expires, but did want to make sure that we address this final question. And this is regarding the CEC, and it's, does the Energy Commission support new renewable technology that can be delivered on demand when solar and wind go offline?
I think the answer to that is that that would be very valuable, and certainly in the research side, one thing to look at. I think one of the issues you run into is cost structure. I have also worked with the geothermal community, and at one point I was helping Unical try to negotiate with PG&E a contract where we could have made the geysers dispatchable, which I think was, I just never even thought of the concept until the approach. And when we went through, what we found was that, basically Unical's resources, they were paid basically for steam. So if you basically cut that to, say, a third by cycling it up and down, the resources would take an incredible hit. But in terms of the value to PG&E of having a more dispatchable geyser, it was like a tenth of the loss of revenue to Unical. And so both sides just sort of did the math after some very complicated modeling and some pretty ugly negotiations, and concluded you just couldn't make it work. Now, whether that's possible in the current structure for, again, whether people here could build a geothermal project but make it very dispatchable and be able to ramp up and down, whether you could make that economics work. At least we couldn't at the time. Maybe, hopefully people are smarter at this point, or maybe if you're designing the technology so you could do that. But again, people certainly are looking at batteries or some sort of storage as one way to deal with the fluctuations. Demand response, which frankly is probably 1 or 2 orders of magnitude cheaper than storage at this point, where again people are willing to have their load cycled up and down. And there are things new technologies you can roll out in a smart grid, like San Diego has done, which makes your system more resilient to deal with some of those fluctuations.
Also, another technology that could help with intermittency potentially is biogas, and you can run it in a natural gas plant. But I think it's important to remember on the integration side that we have been balancing energy with natural gas plants for some time, and with low natural gas prices, that source is available. And so I think the challenge for renewables trying to meet that need currently is being cost competitive with gas, especially because we do have these plants that have capacity. As we move forward and go to higher levels of renewables, as well as have more stringent greenhouse gas targets, because it's really about the overall portfolio greenhouse gases, and you can still right now get to some of the targets we need to with having some gas in the system. But as we make those targets more stringent, I think that will increase the economic need for a renewable or a storage-based alternative.
I'd like to introduce the idea of biogas as something that could potentially be very successfully paired with demand response. So in the eastern independent system operators areas, they have tremendous volumes of demand response, but much of that demand response, a third or more in some cases, exists because they have backup diesel-fired generators. Well, in California, that's just not going to pass air quality muster. But you could potentially, I think, with renewable fuels, provide the same capability and perhaps create opportunities for what is really day in, day out demand response to deal with some of the coming challenges on the system.
Okay, well then I hope you have all enjoyed this panel as much as I had, and thank you again to the speakers for being here. If you could all please join me in giving them one more round of applause, and thank you again.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this is the time you've been looking for. It's cocktail hour. And so you're all invited to join us on the patio for a reception before the banquet. The reception goes from 5 to 7. Then the banquet is at 7. If you are planning on attending the banquet, make sure that your badges say banquet on them. If not, please check with the ladies at the reception desk to make sure that you have your banquet ticket to get into the banquet. Also, the exhibition hall closes at 6, so you need to get over there. If you need to finish your passports, you can take them over there now while you're having your drink and finish that off before 6 o'clock. Okay, so thank you everybody for attending today's sessions. I hope you're all attending tomorrow. We have some good sessions on the Salton Sea and also geothermal. So we'll see you tomorrow, and have a good evening tonight.